In this video, we define the scope and magnitude of the current debt crisis, the impact on the global financial system, possible outcomes, and the possible investment implications for various outcomes. We'll also look at the scope of the problem in terms of why government bond defaults are likely sometime in 2012, despite what you're hearing from leaders. I recently had a conversation with a client, and the client said, Chris, I see the numbers, I understand the debt levels, but it's very difficult to understand when do those debt burdens become a problem. It's a fair question, one that's very difficult to answer for your average market participant. Kyle Bass of Heyman Capital Management in Dallas has taken a hard look at the problem and done a lot of research on it. The accepted white paper definition of when you run into a problem is when your government debt levels and the size of your banking system, so if you take these two numbers and add them together, when they get to a point where the sum of them is greater than 5 times your government revenue, that's when you run into problems. Why is that? Well, when the banking system gets extremely large and the debt burden gets extremely large, if the government has to bail out the banking system, the scope of the problem relative to your revenues, it just becomes too big and overwhelming. Let's look at the current state of the world. 5 times government revenue relative to these two numbers is when you start to run into problems. These numbers here tell us that we've got problems that are going to be difficult to address. Ireland was one of the first countries to run into problems. We know Spain, Portugal have run into problems as well. And now we're hearing rumblings about France and Germany. Greece has gone down. Italy has moved towards the forefront in terms of potential problems. A fair question would be, why is Italy in the news and why are their bond yields spiking when it seems that they're in better shape than Germany? Well, as we'll show in some flowcharts, it really has to do with the health of the German economy and balance of payments. The German economy is much more efficient and healthy than Italy's economy right now. What a current account is, it's your balance of payments. So think of it as your net imports versus exports, basically the net of the two. And what you see here is Germany is exporting more goods than they're importing. And why is that important? When you're running a current account surplus and you're above the zero line, it means that foreign capital is flowing into your economy. And as we'll show later, some of that money ends up in the banking system, and it makes it easier for Germany to service their debt levels. Contrast that with Italy, who's running a current account deficit, which means their economy is not nearly as healthy or efficient as the German economy, and thus it makes it more difficult, especially longer term, for them to service their debt. It also means that instead of foreign capital flowing into the country, you've really got money flowing out of the country, which again exacerbates your problem in terms of servicing debt levels. Portugal, similar problem, running a deficit. Spain, running a deficit. Greece, running a deficit. So for all these countries, to try to grow your way out of it is difficult. If Europe were to go into a recession, and most people believe that's where we're headed, it becomes more and more difficult to service the debt that they have. Japan, who is not in the news currently, but was high on that list in terms of potential problems, still runs a current account surplus, which means foreign capital is flowing into the Japanese economy. The concern longer term, as cited by Kyle Bass, is that their current account is shrinking. The smaller this gets, and as this trend line goes down, longer term, it's going to be very, very difficult for Japan to deal with this imbalance here, which would be, if you add up their government debt plus the size of their banking system, 37 times is greater than 5 times, which says potentially you have a problem. Another thing that's important for all of us as investors is we obviously need to take the messages that are being delivered from government leaders with a grain of salt. And let's look at a historical example. If you remember the 1994 tequila crisis, Mexico was persistently saying, we're not going to default on our debt, we're not going to devalue our currency. In fact, they made that statement one day, and the next day, they devalued their currency. History tells us that while Mexico was saying we will not devalue, we will not default, they had already 10 days earlier met with business leaders and tried to get feedback on what's going to happen when we devalue. Had they, during that 10-day period, not answered the questions in this manner, then you would have had an uncontrolled situation that they didn't want. So if you're a European leader right now, even if you believe that there's going to be restructurings or devaluations or someone's going to leave the euro, you can't tip your hand because the markets will get ahead of you. So we have to take, again, with a grain of salt, the statements that we get out of any country or from any leader, because they can't tell you, yes, we're planning on defaulting, yes, we're planning on breaking up the euro. They're trying to get this thing under control as best they can, and they want to manage when that default or partial default comes or when someone's going to leave the euro. If we fast forward to the present situation, in January of this year, Greece was saying we're not going to default. We're going to meet all of our payment obligations. It's not our roadmap. That's not where we're going. And as we all know now, Greece, as I speak, is currently working with creditors to wipe out 50% of their debt obligations. They can call it a voluntary restructuring. The reality is that's a form of a default, even though we heard from European leaders that for a long time that no one's going to default. Now we're going to take a more detailed look at the problems that we currently have. And the three main players in the financial markets are central banks, so think the Federal Reserve in the United States, or the European Central Bank, or ECB in Europe. Then you've got your large financial institutions like Bank of America, Goldman Sachs around the globe, and then we've got governments, which are also known as sovereigns, and we know the problem is too much debt. We're going to take a very broad look at this. We're more concerned about concepts than specifically how money flows through the system. If you understand conceptually how money flows, you can make much, much better decisions going forward. We're going to look at healthy markets versus impaired markets, some possible outcomes, which may be termed as solutions. Why have the financial markets been so volatile, difficult, and trendless recently? We'll look at outcomes going forward and match them with possible investments. And what you'll see is these three bullets here are all interconnected. In the United States, we've got problems that are well known that speak to the mismatch between our revenue and our spending. And we all know that there's a mismatch here. How big is that mismatch? Well, our revenue that we bring in annually is roughly 16% of GDP, which means if you took the value of all goods and services produced in the economy in 1 year, multiplied it by 16%, that's basically what we take in, what our government takes in. What we spend, unfortunately, is almost twice that. It's 26% of GDP. That's a ratio of roughly 1.63 to 1. And we all know that if our household was spending 1.6 times more than what we took in, we'd have some problems. The way the government deals with this is they're constantly borrowing money. Let's take a look at spending. There's three main areas of spending. We've got non-discretionary spending, which includes things like Medicare and Social Security, which would be things that we've committed to do. And to understand this imbalance, our revenue, for the most part, is chewed up by this box here. When we go to discretionary spending, which would be other programs, and the big component of that would be defense spending, most of that is done with borrowed money. And the fact that we're doing it with borrowed money means that we also have to service debt, which means when bonds mature, we have to pay principal back when U.S. Treasuries mature. And we also have to make interest payments on those bonds as well. Shifting gears here, what is the primary way for the U.S. government or any European government to raise capital to keep this imbalance going and to keep the government running? Most of the government bonds that they sell them in an open auction that determines the interest rate. Most of those bonds are bought by large institutions that we talked about here. So they send money to the government, and the government gives them a treasury bond in return. Comes to this side. Mainly we're talking about banks and brokerage firms here. So think Bank of America, think Goldman Sachs. How do they raise capital? Well, in normal markets, they can sell stock. So cash comes in, a stock certificate goes out. They can take on deposits. And deposits speaks to a broader issue, which would be a country's balance of payments. In Germany, they export a lot of goods. So think BMWs and Mercedes leaving the country. So they've got a positive balance of payments. So that really means that money's coming into Germany from other countries, which some of it ends up in their financial system. Using the fractional reserve system, that money can actually be levered up, or they can create new money. So those deposits coming in or money coming in from other countries can be levered up. That can be used to keep this going and to buy bonds. Another way for a bank or a Wall Street firm to raise money is they can go out into the public market and sell a bond. Obviously, the health of banks and financial institutions impacts the financial markets, and it also impacts their ability to make loans to the real economy. And that's where you run into problems. You talk about a credit crunch, is when these institutions are not healthy, they have a tendency to reduce the number of loans that they make to small businesses, large businesses, anybody, which would have an impact on the broader economy.